Welcome to Epistemology.
You know what I like a lot more than materialistic things? Knowledge. What is this?
It's a podcast. Greetings! Thanks for tuning in for another episode of Epistemology, your occasional panacea for intellectual boredom. I'm Dr. Mark Fabian, and my guest this week is Dr. Rod Graham, an Associate Professor of Sociology and Criminal Justice at Old Dominion University. Rod joins me to discuss the vexed paradigm of positivism, arguably the dominant epistemology of contemporary science, and certainly of Twitter denizens who like to think of themselves as scientific. We consider not just the merits of positivism, but also its limitations and blind spots, especially with regard to the present cultural moment, where marginalized people and groups are speaking up about how their perspectives, their data, if you will, has been neglected or misunderstood by positivists. We discuss alternate ways of thinking about epistemology and research, notably interpretivism and critical theory, and the contribution they make to knowledge. We also touch on the ways qualitative and quantitative research methods figure into these research paradigms. Get ready for a wild ride.
This is not going to be pretty. We're talking violence, strong language, adult content.
Epistemology. Welcome, Rod Graham, to Epistemology. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Excellent. So we're talking today about kind of positivism on the one hand, which is sort of an epistemological theory, I guess, and interpretivism, which is sometimes seen as its kind of, I don't know, a parallel or a different way of seeing things. And we're also talking about some kind of tensions that have come up, at least in our very online lives, where people are coming either from a positivist point of view or from a critical theory point of view, and kind of getting into arguments. So I just wanted to kind of bring you on the show to talk about some of these theories, because I really like your Twitter presence and the way you kind of navigate some of these ideas, and I thought it'd be great to have a chat to you. So I thought we would maybe start the scene just with some of your kind of personal experiences of these issues, particularly coming from Twitter. Like, I was just hoping you could maybe tell us some war stories to kind of set the scene, something like that.
Yeah, I saw that, when you sent me that, and I don't know if I have war stories so much,
Sure.
but it is the case that, especially last year, when there was a lot of social unrest in the U.S. Around race issues, I took to Twitter to talk about it a lot. And so for your listeners, maybe I should situate myself so they'll know like where I'm coming from. I teach a research methods course. I've been teaching it for a long time, and I like teaching research methods. And so I would find that a lot of people would be talking about critical race theory, critical theory, how we understand things like police brutality. And I realized that I was in a good position, although I don't use I'm not a critical scholar in my actual research when I get the time to do research. It is the case that because I teach these issues so much, I have a fairly good understanding of not just critical theory, but also other ways of understanding our world. So I said, all right, fine. I'm interested in these social justice issues, and maybe I can communicate about it. So that's how it kind of all got started. And there aren't any war stories, but it is the case that I do get a lot of conversations, or I get into a lot of conversations with folks about whether or not critical theory is, I think, falsifiable is something that you mentioned. Is it a real theory? Can it be testable? This type of thing. And so I have to have these conversations saying that that's not exactly how it works, and tell people that without, being a jerk about it, And so, and I have and they're still going on, actually. Every time something comes up, it's always the same thing. Like you use a term like whiteness or white supremacy or white privilege. And so folks want to know, like, that's the thing now, it seems, on Twitter. So folks want to know, well, what does that mean? How do you define it? Is that a theory? So yeah, a lot of conversations about those things.
Okay, cool. And so when you say, like, so people come to you and they're talking about falsification, or they're talking about whatever, quantitative versus qualitative, this kind of stuff. And I'm really cool. I did have a look at your publication page, and you've been involved in some joint projects that involve all those different methods, which I thought was really cool. Try and do some of that stuff ourselves in my research group. So when you say that that's not quite how it works, and that's something that you're trying to explain to these critics on Twitter, can you give us a rough sense of how it does work? Like, where are you coming from?
Yeah, I'll try. My sense is that a lot of people have a view of science, which is I guess, a positivist view. It's sort of the scientific method. You generate a hypothesis, and then a falsifiable hypothesis. You collect data, and then you judge that hypothesis based on that data. You accept it, you reject it, refine. The thing that I used to teach when I was a long time ago, I was a biology teacher in high school in another life. And so, that's kind of the way that a lot of people understand science. And it's actually, although it may not be, I think philosophers have really pushed back against that idea of, I guess we call it simple falsification. But I think for practical purposes, it's fine. That distinguishes science from pseudoscience, right? And so that's fine. But then they bring that to these complex issues where I'm a sociologist by training, and most sociologists realize that you have to look at the world in a more complex way. So some questions, depending on your perspective, you may want to set up some type of statistical experiment in a way to get an answer. But other times the question is about meaning. And so in that sense, there's no falsification. You're just simply trying to understand how people think. So there's a positivist way of thinking, which is the collecting hard data, measurable things, where you have agreement on that measurement. So intersubjectivity, so you collect the data. And people are very comfortable with that, and they see that as science. But then there's another type of actually science as well, where you're not hypothesis testing, but what you're doing is you're looking at the meanings that people attribute to things. And depending on your question, you may be able to answer your question just with this type of research. It's called interpretive research or qualitative research. So I guess a good example I could give would be, so I studied cyberbullying, or in the past. And so you can look at that through a very positivist scientific method type way, where you say, okay, I'm going to measure cyberbullying in this way, maybe the amount of negative comments on Twitter or something, however you want to measure it. And then I'm going to look at the impacts on grades, right? That would be a standard approach. And you collect grades, you collect the Twitter comments, and then you see if there's a statistical non-random relationship. Okay, fine, that's beautiful. However, when you do that, you're often missing a lot of other information that you need to know to fully understand. So it's one thing to test a hypothesis, but maybe there are other parts of that you're not getting. So like, how do the students feel about being cyberbullied, or are there other variables that you're not taking into account? How do the words make them feel, or this type of thing? And so those questions are also interesting, and that's also science, because you're understanding the world. So all that is to say is that when I get in these Twitter conversations, and people want to show me a data, talk about some kind of bivariate relationship between, I don't know, police killings and race, I will tell them, yes, that's interesting, but that's not the full story at all. You also have to look at how police and how citizens interpret their world, and that's actually going to give you probably a little bit more information about what's actually going on.
All right, thanks for participating in our focus group, kids. Today, we're going to show you some itchy and scratchy cartoons.
Cool!
Okay, how many of you kids would like Itchy and Scratchy to deal with real-life problems like the ones you face every day?
Great idea. Yeah, that's it.
And who would like to see them do just the opposite, getting into far-out situations involving robots and magic powers? So you want a realistic, down-to-earth show that's completely off the wall and swarming with magic robots.
Yeah. Good.
And also, you should win things by watching.
You kids don't know what you want. That's why you're still kids, because you're stupid.
Yeah, I'm really struck by this attitude that kind of qualitative research of that sort is not integral to the general knowledge building process. So I guess I would identify as fairly much a positivist. Like, I'm definitely in that camp, I think, more than most people. But at the same time, I mean, even when I was even more positivist than I am now, about 2 years ago, my view was that at the very least, anything that's at the frontier of knowledge, like anything that we're studying that we really don't know about, it's new, has to begin qualitatively. You got to just get in there, start talking to people, start looking around, get messy, get really into the details, try to build a kind of rich picture of the phenomenon that you're interested in. And then once you've got some kind of handle on that, then you can start to identify little components of it that you could specify as a kind of testable hypothesis and start to think about maybe doing some qualitative research on. And I think one kind of body of work that's like this that I find really inspiring is some of the work in sociobiology. So particularly Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics, did some really path-breaking work in this space where she had noticed that a lot of small community groups were able to manage common resources more efficiently than markets left to their own devices or governments running them. But she hadn't identified enough of these groups to run kind of quantitative analysis, and obviously something very complex was going on. There were like religious practices involved, cultural practices involved, interpersonal relationships. A lot of feelings were sitting behind the kind of relationships that upheld these things. And so obviously that kind of research had to begin qualitatively and had to begin interpretively. So like one of her most famous case studies, as I understand it, is of this water temple system in Bali, where dozens and dozens of people have now gone and studied this group, where they had to kind of talk to people and really get a rich sense of what was going on. And then over 20, 30 years of anthropologists in particular studying all these different common pool management systems, they gradually developed various ideas as to what the kind of key variables were, how, for example, mechanisms of punishment were maintained to ensure cooperation in these groups. And then on the basis of that, they started to hone their hypotheses. And over all this time of doing these case studies, they'd also built eventually a data set that they could now do quantitative analysis on. And that seems to me like a kind of really clean story of how these two things operate in harmony. But now that I've, one thing that's happened recently to me that's kind of taken me even outside that kind of way of thinking about this balance is that I had this colleague who was telling me about, she's a feminist philosopher, and she was saying that in her opinion, one thing that's kind of missing from positivism is that it's only in investigating, as you say, these kind of meanings that people ascribe to things that you often realize there is something to study in the first place. So the kind of positivist emphasis on, I guess, like sensory experience, devoid of the meaning and the allegory, means that you miss a lot of stuff. So the example that she gave is that in the early feminist movements of the 50s and 60s, it was only by problematizing sexual harassment and by women getting together and talking about their shared experiences and saying like, don't you think there's something a bit weird about that, a bit wrong? Like, you know, it makes me feel a particular way, and that seems really bad, that they managed to articulate this thing that then became sexual harassment and became the object of study. And then you can turn it into something that you can study in a positivist way. But what was really striking to me about that is that I thought that the architecture of positivism really struggled to incorporate that knowledge generating process. And it sat much better with these kind of modes that I associate with interpretivism, like lived experience and people's kind of on the ground knowledge and this kind of stuff. Do you have any reactions to that?
That's interesting. I would not have thought of it that way. The example you gave of the feminist philosopher and problematizing sexual harassment, I would not have thought. I would have thought of that as simply theorizing. Mm-hmm. Obviously, that's not what's going on. I mean, you're telling me here, but that was my thought. I would not have thought of qualitative research or interpretive research in that way, but I can see how it can be that way. Mm-hmm. I am familiar with your first example, the sociobiology example, because that is a pretty standard way. You go in, you don't know what the meaningful variables are, and so you decide to go in and just observe, do some kind of participant observation, and learn about what's important. Then over time, you can develop some kind of general understanding, which you can then go back and measure some kind of statistical way. That's kind of how I see qualitative research. But I think it's also important to realize that sometimes just the questions themselves are enough. So the way that you've somewhat narrated it is, I believe, a little problematic.
Yeah, great.
Just a bit, because it assumes as if somehow the qualitative analysis part is the initial stage, and you really don't know until after you've done the qualitative work. As if qualitative work is sort of preliminary, and I don't necessarily take that view. I do more quantitative research. In fact, I have trouble getting qualitative research published, actually.
Yeah.
But I don't see it as a preliminary stage. I see it as they're just two different ways of collecting information and generating conclusions. And depending upon your question, you either choose a qualitative or quantitative, or sometimes both. So, but that's just my way. In fact, there's a lot of talk about critical theory, and the thing about critical scholarship is the way in which it collects data. The people who do critical theory collect data is going to be either qualitative or quantitative. Right? So it's going to be one of those major ways. That's the only way you can collect information. However, what makes that different is the process by which someone understands. So your example of the feminist philosopher, I would have seen that as critical scholarship. It's like you're trying to think outside of the normal ways of thinking. You're critiquing things, as it were, without data yet, but you try and understand the world by focusing on those power structures and on those institutions. So I guess in a way we have the three ways, right? The three ways that I know of as a sociologist, and that is the positivist way, the interpretive way, or qualitative way, and then the critical scholarship, broadly speaking.
So how would you define critical scholarship, in particular, as distinct from interpretivism?
So critical scholarship is goal oriented. And the goal is, and this is what gets a lot of people a little upset about it, but the goal is, broadly speaking, human liberation or human flourishing. And so it focuses on those isms that we don't like: sexism, racism, xenophobia, transphobia, this type of thing. And so with that goal in mind, then you go back and you try and think about what sort of institutions, with respect to critical race theory, is generally law and policy. What law and policy, what policies are generating those disparities or those inequalities? And so you do that however you can. It could be from reading, doing history. It could be from reading legal scholarship. It could be from interviewing people qualitatively. It could be from looking at hard data.
Hello, ma'am. I am a census taker with the U.S. Census Bureau.
Oh, terrific. Good for you. Bye.
So this is how I tend to teach research methods. I say, well, what is the question? What do you want to answer? So you start with that first, and then whatever that is, then that will determine, what type of research methods you use, maybe what type of theories that you use, and if you think of it in that way, then there isn't that much of an opposition. You can think of research more holistically, because there's so many questions to answer. So you just choose the method that works the best.
Okay. Do you have any examples? I've got one that I'd like to bring up, but I want to make this conversation mostly about you. So do you have any examples of a research question that you think is kind of really emblematic of what interpretivism can do really well? Or any research questions that are emblematic of what critical scholarship can do really well?
How questions often. So maybe something like, something has to think on my feet here a little bit, but how do two people accomplish a date or a romantic outing? Okay. And so that's going to be about not just what, like, it's very hard to measure that with concrete numbers, but you can interview folks before, during, and after a date. You can observe what happens. And the idea is that at that micro level, people are negotiating their reality. And so at the end of that date, it's a positive one or a successful one, or negative one, depending on whether or not they'll see each other again, I guess. And so in order to answer that question and understand how it is that people accomplish that date, you'll have to do some type of participant observation, or any of these really complex type things, right? Like so like a prom. Like how would you start a prom? Like what's going on there? I'm imagining, you know, we're in different countries, but I'm imagining that there's possibly some equivalent or the same thing in Australia or the UK, where you're a high school senior, you're graduating, and then you
for sure.
Okay. I wasn't sure. So
Australia definitely has that. I can't speak for the UK, but Australia's got them. Yeah.
Okay, great. So that's just not something you want to put in the numbers. You want to understand how people are navigating that situation. How do they go about handling it? So, in fact, most like anything that a social worker or maybe someone who is dealing with human relationships on a small micro level, it's probably that they have to just talk to people and understand how people are understanding their marriage or understanding their life in general, addiction even, right? So
yeah, it's interesting that you bring up marriage, because this is so I work in wellbeing scholarship, and the kind of relationship between marriage and life satisfaction and emotional experience on a day-to-day basis has been an area of research that's frustrated me for a very long time, in part for the reasons that you described, that you know, marriage is this kind of very nebulous concept that's quite hard to pin down. So when you say in the data that, we see that you know, these big, giant data sets, 100,000 people and stuff, or we see that married people are happier than unmarried people. I'm like, what's going on there?
Yeah,
what even is marriage? So are they in a happy marriage? Are they in an unhappy marriage? And that's, I mean, that point as well. In the Australian data, we have this panel series called Hilda, where you can track people over time. I think there's just under 20,000 people in it. One of my old colleagues back in Australia, they did a study where they did the same headline finding, married people are happier. And then they looked at people who said that they were dissatisfied with their marriage, and they found that those people were super unhappy. So they'd actually be much better off if they didn't get married. And so I think even once you scratch the surface just a tiny bit, you're already seeing that this thing, marriage, is just kind of way too complicated for you to kind of state it in this straightforward way. Like, is your kind of advice to people, well, just go and get married? But then, you know, obviously it matters whether you're compatible with the person you're going to get married with, what the courtship process is, all that sort of stuff. I want to give you another example, just because I'd be very grateful for you to help me think through the interpretivist and critical scholarship elements of it. So I'm doing some research at the moment where we're working with a anti-poverty charity in the UK to co-create. So we're working with some lived experts who have gone through being assisted by the charity. So we're working with the lived experts and the charity in a co-production setting to come up with a theory and some measures of thriving that the charity can use to inform its work. Because what they want to do is they want to go beyond just helping people through financial hardship to thinking about how they can at least put them on a trajectory towards thriving. And so we've been working in a very qualitative, very interpretivist way, where we have this working group of a couple of academics, some representatives from the charity who are bringing a kind of practical perspective, like making sure that what we come up with is actually useful to them. And then 4 lived experts who are bringing their value judgments in particular, but their kind of meanings and experiences. And I've found the project very stimulating so far. And I think the theory we've come up with is really cool. But 2 things kind of stand out for me about it. One is that when I'm talking to people in the policymaking space, there's a lot of concern about the representativeness of the people that we're working with. And I usually respond to that in 2 ways. So on the one hand, I say, well, I have to balance how unwieldy this process is. Like, I need a rich understanding of this lived experience, and I can't get that if I'm having to talk to 400 people because I just don't have those kind of man hours and we can't process that kind of data. So we've got to limit it somewhat. And then the second thing I say to them, because they're all operating in a very positivist mode, is to say, well, we have this 4 lived experts, then we're going to have a workshop of another 12 people, bringing 12 extra people in, and we're going to kind of deliberate on what we've come up with so far, see if they endorse that. And then we're going to also put it to a kind of online survey of people who've interacted with the charity to see whether they endorse it in a much simpler way. And that way we think we get some kind of democratic assent to what we've produced. It's interesting to me that we're trying to fit it into this kind of positivist way of thinking. We're also doing interpretivist work, I think, in the heart of it is really interpretivist. And a lot of the scholarship that I've read in trying to think about how we should approach this research has been coming from a very critical scholarship kind of perspective, like particularly principal action research and these kind of participatory modes where they were trying to empower. A lot of it was coming out of public health in the US, working with African-American communities in that kind of space who were really sort of marginalized by the policy apparatus and trying to develop these co-production mechanisms as a way to empower people and get them thinking critically about their own situation. So do you think that all 3 of those kind of ways of doing research are present in what I'm doing, or have I missed something? Have I mischaracterized it?
No, it seems like you know, the policymakers always want some sort of hard measurement, right? I mean, actually, I think you have far more experience doing this type of stuff than I do. But I'll give my best shot. So it seems like the you know, most people in policy and most people who are not doing social science research, and just for practical reasons, policymakers want something that's generalizable. So that you know, that has to come from a positivist standpoint. So I don't have any problem with that. But then, in order to know that what you're generalizing makes any sense to the people in the space, you have to do qualitative research. The critical part about this, I don't know. So I'm a little. I understand the point of critical scholarship, and it's very good for thinking about thinking outside the box and coming up with understanding. So in that sense, it's good, but as long as it's not a standalone thing, but one of the 3 in its holistic way, I think it's fine. Okay. So yeah. For me, the grant work I've done, which has been very small, had to do with training modules for cybersecurity for students who are in this cybersecurity program. So it wasn't this type of like this real heavy duty stuff that you're doing. But even for that, the grant funders wanted us to not only get surveys of students and how they felt, but then also get some kind of hard data, because everyone loves hard numbers. So we had to do some kind of pre-test and post-test about what they've learned and stuff. They didn't care about the critical stuff though. So that was fine, but it seems like you're doing something that's quite beneficial, and I'm actually envious of what you're doing. That sounds pretty good.
That's nice. It's interesting. So the critical part has been tough for me to wrap my head around because I find that the kind of methodological stuff that I'm reading from the critical people, just as you say, is a bit kind of pre-committed to a normative mission. And I do think that people in poverty in the UK are very marginalized in a structural way. And so I want to at least keep my mind open to the critical perspective, but I don't necessarily want to adopt it immediately. And then the other thing that's been really interesting about it, relatedly, is that several of the lived experts kind of emphasized that they, in the past, had internalized values from the kind of dominant cultural milieu that were really bad for them, like patriarchal values in particular and materialistic values. And it was only when they kind of, for various reasons, managed to sort of break out of that and start to think more kind of authentically and freely about their existence that they were really able to start to thrive. And so there I started to think there's a difficult balance to be struck here, where I've got to kind of prod people to tell me whether they do think that the prevailing norms are fine, or whether they think that we really do need a kind of structural element to whatever we come up with. Yeah, which is
interesting. That's interesting. Well, I mean, the beauty of critical theory is that it forces you to examine, our preconceived notions about things and the categories we use.
We're going to take a test.
All right, a test.
It's called the Career Aptitude Normalizing Test, or CANT.
If I could be any animal, I would be A, a carpenter ant, B, a nurse shark, or C, a lawyer bird.
Question 60. I prefer the smell of A, gasoline, B, French fries, or C, bank customers.
Here's your scientifically selected career.
Architect.
Mm-hmm.
Insurance salesman.
Mm-hmm.
Salmon cutter. Military strongman. Systems analyst. Systems analyst. Systems analyst.
Systems analyst.
All right.
You mentioned, the questions you sent me, critical race theory. And I had to do a lot of background work because that's a specific variant within just critical scholarship broadly, because critical scholarship could be feminist, it could be looking at queer scholarship, but critical race theory is very specific in that it looks at law and policy and how it has impacted people. And I'm bringing this up because the same way that the people that you were talking with and how they say that, they started thinking differently about things and it was liberating. I'm paraphrasing, but that's kind of what
I endorse that. Yeah.
Well, the same thing happened to me, right? So because I was just a standard, sociologist, and I wasn't always thinking about how these laws sort of created categories that we then live by, or these policies have these small, tiny effects that over time, lead to these changes. And, it was a very eye-opening experience. And I found it very, liberating in a sense. So that is great. I mean, I in that sense, all critical scholarship is wonderful, but it's also the case to me that sometimes because you are looking for sexism or transphobia or racism, well, you're going to find something, and you may not take that step back unless you work with someone who's collecting a lot of hard data on these issues. You may simply just always find racism. And that's not good either. Some things aren't always about racism or sexism. So that's one of the flaws. But that's kind of normal. I mean, if you try to do something all positivist, as you said, with the broad macro level families, marriage things, you're going to miss stuff. And if you only look at micro level interpretive stuff where you're just talking to people, you're going to miss those broad patterns.
Yeah.
So if you're only looking at ways in which people are oppressed and marginalized, then you might miss the ways in which, they have some personal autonomy or they're not being oppressed and marginalized.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I guess one thing that concerns a lot of positivists around what you just said is that you might, because you're interested in particular things, you might sort of go looking for outliers because outliers are really interesting. So when I went to economics in grad school. Prior to that, I was doing mostly political theory, history, particularly history of sexuality, and philosophy. And one of the things that really struck me going across to economics was quantitative research methods, which I'd never seen before. And it was really interesting to me that in analytical philosophy in particular, the standard kind of mode of reasoning is to argue by counterexample. So someone says, well, I reckon that, I don't know, well-being is this. And then someone says, no, well, I can think of this bizarre case where that definition doesn't work. And so what you end up doing is you kind of plot these points of all these kind of bizarre hypotheticals that you've developed, and then you're trying to draw a border around them and say that the concept must match all of that. And in economics, and I think generally in the quantitative approach, it's kind of the opposite. You get your scatter plot, and you have your XY graph, and you have all these points, and then you say, oh, I'm going to fit a line, right? Or I'm going to look at the average. And if you've got a phenomenon that's distributed, and you can explain a big chunk of that distribution, you're like, that's hot. I'm onto something. Whereas I think for a lot of people who are coming from a kind of more qualitative perspective, just as a dispositional thing, the average is kind of boring to you. Like you're much more interested in this kind of unusual thing going on here. Like what's with this Balinese water temple? And these guys are managing their water resources really well. That's really interesting. I want to look at that. And so I think often that's one reason why we just kind of talk past each other, is simply that some people are really interested in outliers. And to the quant people, the outlier is kind of something to be ignored and dealt with later. Yeah.
Interesting. Huh. I never thought of it that way, but that makes a lot of sense to me.
Oh, great. Okay.
The philosophy part. I mean, I don't know anything about, but this idea of I just never thought about it. That makes a lot of sense. So I mean, like what would be a concrete example of this? Would it be like a concept that you're trying, like capitalism or something? And so you're trying to show examples of capitalism in different countries, and for it to be capitalism, it must meet these conditions, this type of thing.
Yeah, that sort of thing. So you'd say, okay, so my definition of capitalism is that I don't know, it must have X, Y, Z qualities. And then someone will come along and say, well, that doesn't work because we would all agree intuitively that this other country is definitely capitalist, but it doesn't meet your condition Z. So condition Z can't be right. And we need to either kind of rejig the parameters or make things thinner. And I find that what tends to happen in a lot of analytical philosophy is that either you just carve off stuff and you say, this is not capitalism, this is something else, or you end up with a very thin definition of the concept. So I remember a paper that kind of annoyed me that was about what sort of beings have well-being. And after going through one of these kind of processes, the guy ended up saying, was kind of debating whether yeast has well-being or not. And I was like, I think this concept has lost usefulness at this point. Yeah, but I think that's kind of the approach, and it can be very useful in a lot of cases. And I think it's also a very good way, as in many cases, to kind of start off an inquiry. It helps you to kind of map the landscape. But then I think it often ends up in these kind of weird cul-de-sacs. But philosophers love that stuff. They love finding themselves at a dead end. I think that's where they prefer to be. But I want to come back to this point you made earlier about policy, because I think that's where a lot of the animosity in this space kind of comes from. Mm-hmm. And I really liked your point. I think it's a rich thread that we can draw on about how you want to make sure that your policy makes sense to the stakeholders. So could you elaborate on that a bit for me, please?
Well, I think one of the core tenets of interpretive sociology or interpretive research is that whatever explanation you generate, you want to then show that to people in that scene and see if they agree on this explanation. The concepts, the relationships between the concepts, the meanings you generate. Because in a way, that's almost like a checking your biases. And oddly, one of the so that's kind of the reason why. But oddly, there's this idea that positivists, that doing statistical tests or experiments or whatever you want to, hypothesis testing, means that you don't have a bias. And on the surface, that might be kind of true, but I try to make the point that once you've selected some variables, well, that's it. You've already biased your research. It doesn't mean that you're incorrect. I mean, you still may find some non-random patterns in the data, right? But you've decided to select these 5 or 6 variables to test, and so that in itself is a kind of bias. Whereas the interpretive scholar may say, look, I know that I'm going into this scene with my own history, and I'm seeing things in my own special way. based upon my social position. But that's okay. You know, I'm going to do, depending on how it's done, a thick description, you know, and just keep collecting data until finally I come to nothing else makes any more sense. You know, I've coded as much as possible, or however it works. You saturated your analysis, or I have 4 people or 3 people to work on it, and we come together. I mean, they come with all of these different ways of dealing with that bias, which means at the end of the day, and then of course they then talk to the people in the scene to make sure that what they're saying is not too off base. So at the end of the day, it might be that those interpretive scholars are less biased in this broad sense than people who are positive. Of course, the most biased folks would be the critical scholars, but it might be that the interpretive. And I'm not throwing shade on the critical scholars now. I'm just saying that they know that they're biased, and that's just their thing. But it might be that interpretive scholarship is the least biased, followed by positivist, followed by critical scholarship.
Yeah, I think a lot of this comes back to the kind of the character of the researcher and whether they're a sort of virtuous researcher or not. And in some ways, I guess positivism, or like, you know, because I would say this is kind of naive positivism to think that you can just like remove any of your kind of priors from the research. I think if you want to be smart, you should take a kind of more of a post-positivist viewpoint, which is this idea that the scientific method is inherently flawed, but it like does good shit. So we can just stick with it and just be like honest about the fact that it's got a lot of problems and we can try hard to fix them. And I think the kind of the open science movement is a big part of that. The replication crisis in psychology, this kind of stuff. We're trying to be better, but this is in no way like bias-free, kind of values-free science. Anyway, so yeah, I think interpretivism, if it's done well, I'd like to think that what we're doing with this charity is kind of honest and virtuous interpretive research. It's like, do you have an axe to grind? Do you have something that you're really biased to find, or are you genuinely kind of in here just trying to get good information and present it well? And are you honestly trying to represent the views of the people that you're working with, this kind of stuff? Yeah, and then I guess that's where like notions of sort of professional accountability and the institutions come into play.
Yeah.
So let's keep going on this making sense to people thing, just because I think this is really rich. So I've been talking a bit, reading around the, what do they call it, the kind of community-based policy or something like that, where, you know, you've got like a small rural community, for example, that has a very big policy issue that the government needs to help them with. And in that sort of situation, it seems to me like positivism just flails, like just kind of falls flat on its face. Like you don't have data points. You've just got this community, and you need to talk to this community and understand their problems. And so, yeah, I guess in that situation, I think the sort of lived experience side becomes really important. But one thing that often seems to come up in this space is this idea that the government requires you to communicate with it in a particular way. So the government only responds to quantitative data, or the government kind of insists that you, as the representative of this community, sort of set up your communication to government to fit the government's kind of way of making sense of stuff. This is kind of how I've tried to understand this ways of knowing idea that seems to come up a lot in this kind of space, and that I think is really triggering for positivists, because they think that there's like one way of knowing and it's like falsification. So just, can you maybe elaborate a bit for me? So I'm pretty naive about this stuff. Like what does ways of knowing mean, and how is that relevant to these kind of things that we're talking about?
Well, maybe this whole conversation is about ways of knowing. Do we collect numerical data and do some kind of deductive reasoning and come to some conclusion that's generalizable? It may be a bit abstract and not as rich, but it may be repeatable across many settings. That's one way. And then the other way is, a second way is to collect data that's not necessarily empirical. It's not always so observable or intersubjective, but and we're doing it through inductive reasoning, right? Since we can do the contrast, deductive, inductive. And we come to some kind of answer that way. And that's one way of knowing. And then I guess the third would be the critical scholarship, which would use any method to so I guess it's abduction, right? Maybe.
Yeah.
The best answer, best possible answer. And so I mean, I guess this entire discussion is about ways of knowing. I guess that may not be a satisfying answer, but that's my answer. But look, you said something about so I've been toying with this idea, and you being it seems a philosopher at heart, or at least used to be.
Maybe.
So to me, it is absolutely the case that words, emotions, things that are non-numerical are not as precise, but they're not as precise simply because it's not intersubjective, right? My interpretation would be a little bit slightly different than yours. At least that's the way I'm thinking about it. Whereas a number is just, okay, 1, 2, 3, we get it, Okay, so, but it's still information.
Yeah.
Right, I mean, at the core of it, it's fine. It's still information. And so I'm thinking over time, especially with computers, instead of having this qualitative, quantitative split, it'll just be information. And, the same way I'm a baseball fan, and baseball is highly stats based, it's highly quantitative, but what they've done in a way is they've used cameras to make something that is inherently qualitative quantitative. So like 50 years ago, we would have said, like a scout would have looked at a baseball player and said, man, he's got a quick bat,
Yeah.
And that would have been the term, quick, or not so quick or something, or give them grades, A, B, C, whatever. Okay, but now because and you had to do that because just like with the dating example I gave earlier, but there's a lot going on, and you just want to know how people do something, So in that situation, there's a lot going on, and you have to do it qualitatively. It's the same here. It's not that person has a quick bat. But you can't, as a person, look at what's going on. Well, they do have a quick, but there are specific things that are going on that you can't measure with just your eyeball. So you say quick bat. But if you have a computer and high definition video recording, then you can look at the turn of the torso. You can look at the bat speed, how fast it moves to the strike zone. All of this stuff to give you the answer that, well, okay, his bat speed is 88.9 or something. The other guy is 72.6, so you should draft that guy.
This is building in all the intelligence that we have to project players.
Okay.
It's about getting things down to one number. Using the stats the way we read them, we'll find value in players that nobody else can see.
It's the same, I think, with the type of work that you're doing now, where you're collecting information. It's just that we don't have the technology yet to make that information intersubjective. But I think it's coming. I do. I think that, so I have a question here somewhere where I could just be rambling, but I'll just keep going.
Yeah,
so I think that, astronomers had their telescope and biologists had their microscope. And I think that social scientists, we got high performance computing that will allow us to take in all this information. And even though it's a million variables, we'll be able to crunch all that eventually, just like now how baseball teams do it.
Okay.
So there's no question. just something that sounds interesting, but at the heart of it, it's all information, qualitative or quantitative. Critical is different, but it's all information. And that's right. So getting back to the government. So maybe you can say justify, like, look, you know what, I'm taking these interviews and I'm quantifying. This is the information, and I'm quantifying it this way. However you want to do it, and maybe the government will be happy with it now in 2020, 21. But then by 2050, those interviews will be so precise, they won't care because it'll be just like numbers. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, an interesting, I think, and fairly optimistic view for maybe like kind of collaboration between qualitative and quant people, where, you know, the qualitative people are going to bring you this kind of very deep data, and then your quant people are going to run into it with their, like, I don't know, machine learning algorithms to,
something like that,
to kind of sort it out. Yeah. I guess so. What's interesting to me on the government front is that I see this running in sort of two different directions. Like, so on the one hand, here in the UK especially, there's an increasing emphasis on co-production, particularly of public policy, and that if you want to, say, set up a new kind of task force or an operation or something like that to try to reduce drug abuse, then absolutely you're going to need to get people involved in that who have personal experience with drug use and recovering from drug use and understand the system in a very kind of personal and rich way, and just having them floating around the system on boards and things like that just gives you a much more kind of on the pulse approach to that problem. And so I see a lot of that sort of stuff going on. At the same time, then in other realms, I see an increasingly strong emphasis on quantitative research and kind of randomized controlled trials and all this sort of stuff. So, for example, in I don't want to go near this issue in the US with a 40-foot pole, but in Australia with prison reform, there's I've been privy to some conversations on this where people will propose ideas that we can be fairly confident are not going to work, and we have pretty good evidence that they're not going to work. But there's this desire to find some kind of evidence that they did work because some bureaucrat has like always wanted to try this. And then in that kind of place, it seems like quantitative methods can really get rid of some junk for you. And they kind of quite definitively say that, no, that was trash and you shouldn't try that again. I don't know really where I'm going with this point at this point.
Great, join the club.
Yeah. But yeah, I guess it seems to me like we can't get away from the fact that these two research methods are complementary in many cases, but also like just have their domains, and that seems to be kind of key. Yeah.
For now.
For now, right? Yeah. Because we're in the computational future, we'll be able to bridge the divide.
Yeah.